It's good.
Lovely stuff. Well, welcome everyone to week 3 of the Bible course. I hope you're feeling excited about the things we've gone through so far. So just to recap where we've been, we've looked at in week 1 just kind of what the Bible is and how do you understand it, in what sense is it inspired and trustworthy. Last week we started with the stories at the very beginning, which is a very good place to start, with the idea of creation and of fall and the consequences from that. Was there anything that people wanted to talk about from last week, or anything that's come up that you've been thinking about, or we were all fairly happy with the contents?
Well, Ed and I have a confession to make that we're a bit behind on last week. We were up to date on the week before and only just caught up on that, but we haven't done our research on this week.
Well, it's a good job we're in the line of hearing confessions and offering out forgiveness.
You're not alone.
But we will be catching up.
Well, yes, you've got a lot going on, so I'm not surprised you haven't found the time. That's fine. So last week we just basically covered, as I say, creation and fall and the idea of those effects still being with us today, in different ways, which is quite an important point. I think we often get uncomfortable, the idea that the world is, we like to think things are bubbly and wonderful, and actually the idea that something has gone wrong somewhere is quite important in how we take an honest and hard look at the world. So that sets out the sort of beginning bits of the Bible. Today we're gonna continue the story along, looking actually quite nicely coincides with the readings we have in Genesis at the moment. So looking at Joseph and the Exodus into Egypt and the return. So, and those themes of the Exodus and what that plays in the sort of mindset and understanding for much of the rest of the Old Testament about Israel being the chosen land and the chosen people of God in the land he's appointed. So that's what we're going to look at tonight. So I think without further ado, we'll start the video and we'll get to our usual discussion point in the middle, and I'll eat my dinner while it plays because I haven't quite managed to do that yet. So I'll enjoy my gnocchi, you enjoy the video.
Have to have a drip feed.
The God of the Bible is a God of freedom. When his people Israel were enslaved in Egypt, God stepped in and rescued them. We call this event the Exodus. The word literally means exit. It's the way out, it's liberation. Even though Israel's Exodus happened a long time ago, the event has inspired freedom movements ever since. Here in London, the famous politician William Wilberforce, along with others, took the Exodus theme of liberation and applied it to the slave trade. After decades of struggle, slavery was legally abolished right here in Parliament in 1833. In the 20th century, the Exodus story energised Martin Luther King's dream of a world without racial divisions. In one of his speeches, he declared, "The Bible tells the thrilling story of how Moses stood in Pharaoh's court and cried, 'Let my people go.'" On April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, but the story of Exodus and liberation lives on. Why? Because in our modern world, there are more slaves than ever before. An estimated 27 million people are bought, sold and trafficked across the globe, with a new victim every 30 seconds. This lucrative trade in human flesh is estimated to be worth $150 billion a year, yet currently only 1% of victims experience Exodus. Wherever there is oppression, the God of Exodus roars, "Let my people go," and calls us to play our part in the story. So let's be inspired to action by the chain-snapping, shackle-breaking, slave-rescuing God of the Bible. Welcome to Session 3, Exodus and the Promised Land.
So today we pick up with the second book of the Bible, simply called Exodus. And it's important to see where this one fits in to the big picture of the Bible story. In Genesis, we saw that after global events, creation, the fall of humanity, the flood, the Tower of Babel, God called Abraham and promised that through his descendants, hope would come to the world. Abraham then had the miracle child Isaac. Isaac had the twins Esau and Jacob had 12 sons who formed the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, one of them, Joseph, was sold as a slave down to Egypt. So to cut a long story short, the rest of Jacob's family then moved down to join him as the storyline of the Bible goes down from Canaan to Egypt. But after 400 years, Israel was becoming so numerous that the Egyptian Pharaoh considered them a threat to national security. His response? To enslave them in labor camps, building his pyramids and palaces. And this is where we pick up the story in Exodus chapter 2.
Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew.
God remembered. Now, what does that mean? Well, not that he ever forgot, but now these poor slaves are in the forefront of God's mind. He cares about them, and he is going to act decisively to save them. Now, when life is tough, it's easy for us to think that God's forgotten us. But remember, behind the scenes, God is lining up the help that we need. Exodus tells us God knows, God remembers, God cares. So, onto the stage enters one of the key characters of the whole Bible story, Moses. And tradition has it that Moses was the one who compiled the first 5 books of the Bible. Along with Genesis and Exodus, they also include Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And together these are called the Torah, which is often translated law, but really means instruction or guidance. These 5 books will be foundational to the rest of the Bible. And as we've seen in our daily readings this week, Moses was born into a context of genocide. The Pharaoh of his day decided to curb Israel's growth by killing every male Hebrew baby. Moses' mum didn't know what to do, so she made a waterproof basket and floated Moses down the River Nile in it. Ever since, parents have placed their babies in Moses baskets and probably at times dreamt of floating them away as well. Anyway, the basket floated right up to the princess of Egypt, Pharaoh's daughter. She took pity on Moses, even though he was clearly a circumcised Israelite. So she took him into the palace, adopted him into the royal family, and Moses grew up Prince of Egypt. But one day, a now adult Moses witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. He saw red, he killed the Egyptian, and then fled into the wilderness. So Moses ended up in a pretty bleak place called Horeb. It must have felt pretty horrible for Mo. But remember, the God of the Bible is into recycling. He can take screwed up lives and transform them. In Exodus chapter 3, God appears to Moses in the form of a burning bush and calls him to play the lead role in the unfolding drama of Exodus. Who would have thought it? If you'd known Moses in his horrible years, you would have concluded, if God can use him, he can use anyone. And that's the point. So out in the middle of nowhere, Moses sees a burning bush. Now, in the hot, arid wilderness, that was not such an unusual sight. But this bush got Moses' attention.
Moses said, "I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, "Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground."
Understandably, Moses was shocked and frightened. Panicking and stalling for time, he asked God, "So, what's your name?" And God's reply is highly revealing. You see, to know someone's title is one thing, Mr., Mrs., Reverend, Doctor, and that's really all the word God is, a title. But to know someone's personal name introduces a whole new level of trust in the relationship. So what's God's personal name? Well, it's a strange one.
God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you."
This is the eternal God speaking. He does not combust or rust. He has no past or future. He's the great I am. Now remember, the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. And in Hebrew, I am roughly equates to Yahweh. So if you hear someone refer to Yahweh or Jehovah, they're using the divine name God gave to Moses at the bush. Now this name was so sacred that Jews would not dare to speak it. So they replaced it with Lord instead. Now on almost every page of the Old Testament, you'll see Lord in capital letters. Why has someone left the caps lock on? Well, because beneath that word lies the sacred name that God gave to Moses at the burning bush. And so, of course, when early Christians said, Jesus is Lord, it was massive. They were claiming that the God who appeared to Moses had now appeared in person, not in a bush, but in the flesh. So Moses returned to Egypt on a liberation mission. He announced to Pharaoh that the God of Israel says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh was not impressed and refused, so a showdown unfolded. The God of Israel brought 10 plagues, each one an affront to the gods of Egypt. For example, the Egyptians worshipped the god of the Nile, so the first plague turned the Nile into blood. There was also an Egyptian sun god, so the 9th plague brought darkness on the land. The key issue at stake, who is the real God? And as Pharaoh refused to give in, Moses announced the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn male. Now, in a patriarchal culture where continuing the family lineage meant everything, this 10th plague cut to the heart and broke Pharaoh. So he finally let the Hebrew slaves go. Israel moved out of Egypt after centuries of slavery, free at last. Only not quite. Pharaoh changed his mind, chased after them, and trapped them by the shore of the Red Sea. But once again, God stepped in and made a way for his people, parting the waters. This is the God who can make a way where there seems to be no way. And Israel passed through and were delivered free at last. Now, from the other side of the Red Sea, looking back to their former life of slavery, Israel celebrated by singing songs and telling the story of Exodus. Singing is such a powerful way to express freedom. As birds sing after the storm, so Moses and his sister Miriam burst into song.
"I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my Father's God, and I will exalt him."
This is the first song in the whole Bible and the first of many. Singing has always been a powerful way for God's people to celebrate freedom. In fact, the Exodus story then inspired a whole genre of music as Afro-American slaves wrote songs of hope in the face of oppression. The most famous spiritual was called Go Down, Moses, and it included the Exodus refrain, "Let my people go." Now today, when we face fears and challenges, songs can be a powerful response. Put on some music and sing hope over your circumstances, and you'll soon find the atmosphere changes. You know, life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to sing in the rain. Now, as well as songs, the Exodus was celebrated through a meal. When God sent the final plague to Egypt, it did not affect the Israelites' homes, because God told them to take a spotless lamb, sacrifice it, and paste its blood onto their doors with a hyssop branch. Now hold that thought. When the angel of death passed through the camp, he passed over the houses protected by the blood. Hence the name Passover. Now every year since, Jewish families share a meal with symbolic foods that tell this story. Flatbread or matzo symbolizes their rush departure from Egypt without time even to let the dough rise. Then there were bitter herbs and salt water for the tears and pain of slavery. 4 cups of wine structured the meal with readings and prayers. And of course, the lamb was central, symbolizing the sacrifice that enabled salvation. Now, just before his death, Jesus celebrated a Passover meal with his disciples. But in a shocking moment, he reinterpreted the whole thing. Now he was the spotless Lamb of God sacrificed for us. When he died on the cross, wine vinegar was lifted to him on, guess what? A hyssop branch. As we'll see, the death of Christ is the ultimate Exodus event. The New Testament puts it this way: Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. So Christians still take these 2 symbols from the original Passover meal. The bread remembers the body of Christ, broken for us, and the cup remembers Jesus' blood. Through him, we can experience the true exodus of forgiveness and freedom. So after singing songs and telling the story, Israel set off into the wilderness. You can see the rough route that they took from Egypt through the Red Sea, and then they traveled down the Sinai Peninsula. Now this pilgrim people were led by a cloud and pillar of fire. They drank water that poured from a rock and ate some strange food called manna. And eventually they arrived at the foot of a mountain. Not any old mountain, but the same one where God appeared to Moses in that burning bush. From now on, this mountain, Mount Sinai or Horeb, will be known as the Mountain of God. Moses had brought Israel back to the very place where God first called him. He had completed part 1 of Mission Impossible.
So that's the story of Exodus. Israel delivered from slavery in Egypt and brought to the very same mountain where God first called Moses into the action. So let's reflect on that burning bush scene in Exodus chapter 3. Here we encounter God's fiery passion to bring freedom to the captives. And here the great I Am invites us to be part of the mission.
There we go.
Have you been watching a video with this, or is it just for words only?
There's been a video, hopefully.
I haven't got it, you see. That's why I'm interested. I can only see you. James. That's
Have you only been seeing me for the entire time?
yes. So far, yes.
I'm very sorry about that.
No, you don't have to be sorry. Don't worry.
That's not been very.
No, the words just get it a bit. I don't normally listen just through headphones. And he was going quite 90 to the dozen, and I couldn't. I could anyway. Leave it at that. Carry on.
Well, hopefully you'll.
I don't know why. Don't ask me. Don't bother. I can see you anyway, and I can listen. I'll join in. Don't worry.
Good, and don't worry. We'll put this all together with the video so you can watch it.
I'll get it sorted somehow. Yeah.
There we are. So, the Exodus, descent into Egypt, sojourn, and then return by a very convoluted route. Any thoughts on what we've just seen that you want to share?
Yes, he mentioned music. And I, along with other members of our church, years ago, produced a CD that had the theme tune to Exodus on it. And I've still got it. And I thought if I could get this machine to work, I could transmit it because it's relevant to this very passage. Leave it at that.
So, well, that's something certainly to miss.
Maybe I could get it for another time.
Hope so.
You don't know.
I didn't realise that Mount Sinai was the same as Horeb. I hadn't realised that he'd gone back to the same place where.
The difficulty in locating and identifying mountains makes it difficult. Some people think they're the same place. Other people have identified other mountains in other parts. So it's one interpretation. It's certainly very possible, but there are many other locations for Sinai and for Horeb which you could point out, but that makes things more complex.
Another thought is William Wilberforce that was mentioned. There's a scout site at Keston, as you may or may not know, called the Wilberforce Scout Centre. And
Yep.
William Wilberforce sat on a chair in that place, which I've sat on, and next to an oak tree, which was planted just after William Wilberforce had given his discussions on the abolition of slavery. You don't hear that when they talk about politics, as it were, but he discussed the abolition of slavery, and that's why that name Wilberforce is used. Also, somebody that should remain nameless in the church still does a lot of work for Lady Wilberforce, who lives in Chelsea, as a descendant, obviously.
Yeah, the Wilberforce oak's quite well known, isn't it?
But I saw the original oak that was there, and it died, and they planted another one within the centre of the original oak. And it's grown.
That's a nice symbol.
Well, yeah. I've camped on it many times, in the past, obviously. Another life.
So this also, one thing was mentioned in this story, but I think another wasn't, in terms of some people's difficulties with the Bible, and one of them is the fact that God, killed the firstborn of the Egyptians as part of his, attempts to help the Israelites go free.
Mm.
And I think another one is when the Israelites were on the way out. I think the Bible says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart against Pharaoh's heart against the Israelites, and that's why he pursued them. As if he sort of deliberately did that. So. I think we've been looking at some of the challenges of the Bible, and I think that's probably two of them that spring to mind.
I think there's and there's certainly very challenging parts in that stories of plague and judgment. And I think in many ways that final act around the death of the firstborn mirrors or acts as a counterpart to the earlier story of the binding of Isaac, in the sense that Isaac was willing to sacrifice his firstborn for God, whereas the Egyptians were not, not engaging, not fearing of God, and so paid the price that Abraham was spared. I think that's where the parallels come and why that story's there. And obviously it's just a severe penalty. But yeah, no, it is a difficult thing. I mean, how far you accept those things happening is obviously a challenge for some people. Some people would quite happily point out that the 5th, 6th and 7th plagues affect the cattle. But actually, you know, the 6th and the 7th wouldn't have had much of an effect because there'd be no cattle left after the 5th. If you want to be, so there are challenges around where this happened, but I think there is probably, to my mind, you know, this whole part of the Bible is very difficult, especially when we get into the narratives about Joshua, and you sort of we're going to be approaching sort of religious genocide, and how we deal with that's an interesting conversation. But yeah, I it's difficult with those stories. We can either say, oh, let's minimize them and say they couldn't happen, or, you know, and it's designed to it's something to ignore, or we say, you know, that's how it was and that's the nature of God, and that's very complex and brings up tough feelings. I don't know where it lies, but I think from my view there's something about well, how we handle the whole narrative is an interesting question, but that idea of the cost of following God is high, and that mirroring of that story of Isaac and, you know, Abraham being willing to make that is important, and the refusal of the Egyptians to follow God in the same way kind of seals the next part of God's act, which is to actually free the Israelites. I don't know, what do you think? Others think, how do you deal with those hard stories?
I think that the really important, helpful point to me is what Margaret said last week about myth. The idea that to call a story myth is not to reduce the element of its truthfulness, rather the opposite, actually, rather to increase it, because a myth is a story which has the depth of truth about it, and its truth lies elsewhere other than in its historical truthfulness. So these stories are stories which have a historical context and are set out as history. But I think we avoid a lot of the difficulties once we start focusing on the meaning, such as, for example, the idea that all the plagues corresponded to the different gods. And you know, just like there's some of the ideas that you were saying just now, James. You know, these are extremely powerful ideas with extremely immediate meanings for us. And I don't think getting too bogged down with the idea of these things, particularly at such great distance of time. You know, even time between when the events happened and when they were written, which I think is several hundred years ago. There must be a mythical element to them anyway. And I don't think we need to worry too much about the literal historical truth of some of these stories. And it's more helpful perhaps to concentrate on their meaning and the context that they give to the New Testament and so on.
They have a depth, don't they? You're saying they have a depth of truth in myth, is that correct?
Yeah, there's a different kind of truth to truth which is reliant on historically verifiable facts.
I think just thinking about that, Peter, you know, I think that's a helpful way of looking at it, because if you think about a lot of critics of Christianity or faiths based upon the Bible, is that there are some who take literalist views. So they say, you know, is the creation story really true? Is the earth 6,000 years old? And they take things literally, but then they're very happy to point at other, like, literal stories like the ones we're looking at, and perhaps not try and think about the meaning that's behind it, rather than necessarily whether it is, you know, a truly accurate picture of events.
One thing I have difficulty with is their time scales. Was their years the same as ours perceived as nowadays, or were their years much shorter? Because in one of the stories right at the beginning, the couple were very elderly.
Yep.
And then they had, yes, I mean, it would make them almost 100 when they had children. I just find it quite difficult to.
So I think again, these are the challenges of. So look, largely, you know, that their calendar is solar, based like ours, and so a year, you know, roughly you can approximate these periods of time quite easily. But I think everybody in all those stories, and again, we could talk about, you know, the mythic aspects, but they are all of people who live for an incredibly long time. You know, you get the sort of like Methuselah gets mentioned, you know, these figures who live for much longer than what we think is a normal human lifespan. And we can understand those in many ways. Either, again, we could talk about them in that sense of a myth being, you know, a way of emphasizing these characters from an older age, very devout, you know, very different from ours, and that helps make that. Some people do try to literally explain that, you know, humans were meant to live forever until the fall, and actually what you see is the effects of that taking place by shortening human lifespan as you go on through the Old Testament till people live, you know. So at the beginning they're still living longer lives as they're meant to, and then they get shorter towards a normal human life. I think that's probably forcing the facts quite a bit. So one of the differences is none of the timescales wholly match up, and so when you find stories repeated and changed throughout the Old Testament, particularly throughout the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, the timescales slightly change here and there, and I think that's probably reflective of a society where these, before they were written down, these were stories that were told and shared and circulated and around, and took on this kind of quality of epic stories before they were committed to paper, in the way they were told, retold and relived. And so and I think those things like ages probably reflect that, and, you know, they emphasize the exaggerated point, just, you know, that for instance, Abraham and Sarah were very elderly, probably not in their hundreds when they had Isaac, but of a great age where, you know, it emphasizes the miracle and the joy of Isaac coming along, and so on and so forth. That's why I say it, but, you know, there are people who would argue very literally that's how they lived, and that's where they, and that's the way things were. I don't think that's the spirit in which these things were originally written and told.
Yeah, that's a good point, isn't it? Because today we kind of expect journalistic, you know, journalistically verifiable facts, and we have a different view to the way stories are told now, perhaps to when they were written, when you know, their meaning would have been more to the fore than historically verifiable fact, because you couldn't verify things in a historical way in the way that you can now.
No, Margaret, please.
There's something, a link to fiction, that modern fiction quite often is trying to tell some story and some truth that is not to do with the actual content of that book. And surely the important thing about what we've been looking at today is the meaning for us as Christians of the meaning of the Exodus, of being released, God offering us freedom.
Yes.
Surely that's the thing that really matters, not whether, you know, this or that happened. Or
yeah, but particularly given the parallel between the Passover and the Eucharist.
Yes.
So of course,
my
liturgical self say we don't know what meal Jesus celebrated. I'll just put that out there.
No, well, we know that. It was around Passover time, wasn't it?
Yeah, so that's for another time. I think probably the most and I think probably the most interesting parallel we can get, and probably the most accessible, is if you ask yourself, you know, what would you say is the essence of being British or English or Scottish? You know, the idea of nationality. If you were to say the stories of what, you know, what makes Britain great, which is obviously a loaded term in these days, but what is the story of our nation that makes us different from the people on the continent? You know, is it that we are an island nation? Do people look to things like the Second World War and standing alone? Do other people talk of, you know, images of people in bowler hats and cricket and warm beer? What is that kind of story that says what does it, you know, what makes us different from people who weren't brought up on this small cold island in the Atlantic? And when you think about those things, you'll come up with a story and a narrative, and you know, and hopefully we realise that actually doesn't quite stand up to historical verification, doesn't it? You know, we didn't quite stand by ourselves during the war. You know, we needed the help of a whole nationality of people, you know, or a coalition of other people. You know, having an Indian army was quite handy. The Americans quite important. You know, the idea of the kind of cricket and things is, you know, again, a pastoral myth far removed from the reality of many people. All these things you can take apart and say, actually, it's not true. But the power of those stories in the first place are really important in telling us about who we are, what it means to be British or English or Scottish or whatever, you know, whatever your chosen designation and nationality is. And that's kind of what we're seeing in the Exodus. You know, we can talk about whether it happened, in what way, and I can give you some other essays I wrote long ago about the challenges of tying up the Exodus narrative to late Bronze archaeology. Fascinating stuff-ish. But actually the power of this bit of Exodus is actually, this says we were slaves, we were rejected and enslaved in a land far, far away, and through the power of our God, who showed himself, you know, and the point of the plague is to show that he is more powerful than any other, rescued us and brought us into this land. And this is our land because he gave it to us, and we are his people. And that's what makes us different from the Canaanites, from the Philistines, from, you know, the Egyptians, from all these people about. That's what makes us who we are. And that still is an important narrative today if you're an Israeli, about, you know, what should the state and nature of the size and nature of the kind of modern state of Israel be. The more extreme Zionists will still say it should be as it was during King David's reign, because God gave us this land and it's ours. And there's no other argument. And that's a vast simplification of a very complex issue. But it's that thing, isn't it? You know, what we can never quite relate to it in the same way, because, you know, we are not Jewish, we're not Israelis. This is not foundational to who we are as people and to our sense of nationhood and personhood. And, you know, we relate much more to the Eucharist, which is, in one understanding, reinterpreting all this for a new lens. So that you know, we're already one step away. But I think when we look at the Bible, understanding just how important it is that this idea that, you know, God has rescued us from being nobody. He's shown himself to us and given his name, or at least the vowels of his name. And we are now his people, and that's why we follow him, because he's shown his saving power. That's kind of the key thing to do with the Exodus. And I suppose, you know, we would reinterpret that today, that we have seen the saving power of this God, of Jesus. This story can't be our own in the same way, but we can at least understand that, you know, the idea of everything that we owe to this Exodus 2 millennia ago. Does that make sense? The kind of the power of this story is very removed from history, but also creates history, and everything that we come through through the rest of the Old Testament especially comes back to this sense that we are God's people, we've been given this land, and he showed himself to be our God because he rescued us, despite the fact it took 40 years in the desert to get there.
So is there a link to baptism too? Is baptism in water because of the passing through the waters of the Red Sea?
There's multiple reasons why water's been used for baptism. So so that one of the antecedents, the images used in the liturgy, is the parting of the Red Sea. Also the idea of the rock being struck by Moses' staff and water pouring out, in that sense of living water. So it's all these, I suppose all of them are a sense of, there's multiple stories in the Old Testament of water being essential for life, and a gift from God when it's needed, and also that it's controlled and powered to bring about salvation. So yeah, it's one of the it's all there in the background mix of why water is important. If not direct, it kind of forms the background to it. I mean, the actual reasons given are scriptural allusions to, if you want to get technical, John 3, which is about Jesus saying, bring about new life, and water is essential for life. And then the other model and the other understanding is Romans 6, which is Paul talking about dying with Christ. And so there's also another element there in baptism very early on about, it's not actually also about life, it's about drowning. But we tend not to tell parents that interpretation.
I wonder why.
But of course, in the old ways, when you would baptize a baby, you wouldn't just pour some water over your head. You get a large font, you need a big one, and you get the baby, and it'd be like, whole body down, under, left, right. You cover the whole thing under the ceremony, right?
Like the Baptist. The Baptist.
Well, the Baptists do a full immersion, but this is getting a toddler and literally thrusting them face first into the water.
So where does John the Baptist come in then?
Well, we'll talk about that later, I think, when we get towards that bit in the text. But if you get time, look up images of Russian Orthodox priests baptizing children. It's horrifying. But it reflects that entire, that motif. So there we are. We reached the sense of the Exodus, and the message very clearly from the Exodus, regardless of what we think, is that, God is the rescuer of Israel. He takes them out of slavery. He's our God. And for that reason, we're going to follow his ways, which nicely ties into the second part of the video, which is now you've been rescued or in the process of, how are you going to live your lives in response to this action of God? So shall we watch the second part of the video, which is about the law?
If you'd asked an Israelite at Mount Sinai, do you know God? I think they'd have said, nope, but I know a man who does. Only Moses met with God. The rest of Israel cowered at the bottom of the mountain. So Moses, the mediator, bridged the divide between God and his people. But on Mount Sinai, God gave 3 gifts to enable relationship with all Israel: the law, the tabernacle, and the sacrifices. And as we'll see in this second half of the session, each one points forward to Jesus and the New Testament. Firstly then, the law. This was God's way of saying, I care about you. Now notice the order here. It's really important. God first delivered Israel from Egypt and only then gave them the law. So the law was never a means of salvation, but a way of being blessed within the covenant. You may have thought that Christianity was all about trying to be good enough for God so that He'll love you. It doesn't work like that. It never has. When Israel was trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army, Moses simply told them, "Stand still and see the deliverance of the Lord." That's salvation. It's all about what God does for us, not what we do for Him. It's faith, not works. So for us, simply by believing in Jesus, we're saved and adopted into God's family. And only then, as sons and daughters, are we given the house rules so that we can live safe and free. Now, without doubt, the most famous laws ever written are the Ten Commandments, recorded in Exodus and also here in Deuteronomy. Here's a condensed summary of those 10 commandments.
You shall have no other gods before me. Do not make any graven image. Do not take the name of the Lord in vain. Remember the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not covet.
These commandments were a brilliant guide for former slaves to live out their freedom. Imagine if we all kept these commandments. No locks or keys, crime or prisons, family breakdown or rebellious teenagers. The Ten Commandments are a basic moral code for the good of all humanity. Now, in our front garden, there's a line. And if our children cross the line, we shout at them and impose severe sanctions, like a whole day without the iPad. Now, that might sound harsh, but put it in its context. The other side of that line is a busy road. It's because we love them that we lay down the law. The Ten Commandments are God's way of saying, I care about you. Now, as a nation of ex-slaves, Israel also needed further details for life in a wilderness context. Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy contain lots more laws that can seem a bit bizarre to us. So how should we interpret these Old Testament laws today? Well, I find it helps to apply a bit of a filter. There are three basic categories. Firstly, civil laws. Some laws were given to help Israel function as a new nation. But today, God's people are no longer a political state. So these civil laws are not the law of the land for us. However, they still contain transferable wisdom. For example, in Deuteronomy, houses had to have a low wall built around the edge of the roof, because these houses had flat roofs for extra living space. The wall was so that children didn't fall off the roof. In other words, it's basic health and safety that we still apply today. Then secondly, ceremonial laws. These included food laws and rituals, including some very personal instructions about cleansing from skin diseases and bodily fluids. Now, the key here is that in the Old Testament, holiness was expressed physically. So washing rituals symbolize the importance of clean living. Now, we live in a different chapter of the Bible story. What was external has become an internal reality. We don't need to perform cleansing rituals because Jesus has made us clean on the inside. So when we read these laws, we should sigh with relief. Jesus has sorted it for us. But then finally, moral law, summed up by the Ten Commandments. These transcend race or culture and give a universal guide for living God's way. Now, Jesus came not to abolish these laws, but to help us to fulfill them. For example, in one of his sermons, he declared,
You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I say, whoever looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart.
Jesus' teaching goes beyond the letter of the law to fulfill the spirit of it. And by the help of the Holy Spirit, we can live this life of freedom now. When I go mountain climbing, I start the day carrying a heavy rucksack. But as I stop to eat and drink, what was a burden on my back becomes a new energy inside. That's the shift from the old covenant to the new covenant. The moral law felt like a burden to Israel, but now the Holy Spirit gives us new energy to live a life of purity and freedom. So when reading Old Testament laws, it's helpful to think, are these civil laws, ceremonial laws, or moral laws? And how might that affect the way that these apply to us today? Now, the second great gift that God gave at Mount Sinai was instructions for a special tent. This was God's way of saying, I'm with you. Now remember, at this point in Israel's history, everyone's camping. They're a nomadic people. So God effectively says to Moses, build me a tent. I'm going to camp with you. Tabernacle just means place of residence. This is where God lives, right in the middle of the camp. As you got up in the morning and looked out of your tent, you saw this tent and were reminded, God is with us. Now, of course, you would expect God's tent to be a bit different. There was a perimeter fence to guard this holy site. And then inside was a courtyard with an altar for sacrifices. Then there was the actual tent, which, like many modern designs, had an outer and an inner section. And the furniture in the tent symbolized three great promises. Firstly, provision. There was a table with 12 loaves of bread on it as a reminder God always provides for his people. Secondly, protection. A golden lampstand or menorah continually burned, symbolizing God's watchful eye over his people. And thirdly, presence. A thick curtain blocked the way into the most holy place. This was God's room. It contained a wooden chest called the Ark, in which were the tablets of stone containing the Ten Commandments. This Ark was a visible sign of God's presence. So this tabernacle was God's way of saying, I'm with you. It brought peace to the Israelites as they passed through the scary wilderness, knowing that God was with them. Now, on our journey through life, it can make all the difference to know God is with us. Sometimes our kids wake up in the night a bit scared, and as a less experienced parent, I used to try and reason with them. You know, what are you worried about? There's no monster under the bed. Don't be silly. But I've since realized that all they need to know is that I'm with them. It's my presence that brings peace. The Holy Spirit is God with us. His presence in our lives can deliver us from fear and bring deep and lasting peace. Now, the third gift might seem strange. Most of us live in societies where animal sacrifice no longer occurs. But far from being a negative thing, for Israel, sacrifices were a comforting sign that God forgives. Now, there was a whole system of sacrifices recorded in Leviticus. But as we've seen in our daily readings this week, once a year, it was all summed up on the Day of Atonement. All Israel would assemble outside the tabernacle, and then the high priest would take 2 young goats that were spotless. One of them he would offer as a sacrifice, and then sprinkle some of its blood over the people, representing the perfect life of the sacrifice, covering their sins. Now remember, the Israelites are camping. They don't have a whole wardrobe of clothes, and blood stains are hard to shift. So for the rest of the year, they had red marks on their clothes as a permanent sign from God, I forgive you. You've been paid for. You've been atoned for. Now, by the New Testament, it becomes clear that animal sacrifice was only ever a sign pointing forwards to Jesus. Only the blood of Jesus can truly cleanse us from sins.
Therefore, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, let us draw near in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience.
Now with the second goat, the priest would place his hands on its head as a sign of transference, all the sins of the people passing to the goat. Then the priest would lead the goat to the edge of the camp and shoo it out into the wilderness. As the people watched it go and disappear over the horizon, they could say, "There goes my sin, taken away." And that's the idea of a scapegoat. And that's why John the Baptist pointed at Jesus and cried, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." On the cross, Jesus became our scapegoat. Now God can say to us, "I forgive you. You've been paid for." So instead of being trapped in guilt and shame, we can be cleansed and set free through Jesus. Today, we can experience true exodus.
As a young girl, I had no idea what a relationship should look like. So the first boy, I guess, who showed me any interest, it just blew my mind. But it was very, very violent. It was very wrong on every level. But I didn't know any different. And any kind of love, or what was perceived as love, I welcomed with open arms. So although I was enslaved by pornography and by sex, that's supposed to be love, it wasn't. I didn't know I was until much later on, and that was through finding God, that was through questioning God, that was through arguing with God. Through exploring, through coming to church, through reading the Bible, I became clean. One thing that I do remember, and I think is true, that when you read the Bible reads you. And then you start looking at you and you realise, and I realised, I'm not that person. This story is not me. It was then, but it's not anymore. And God has made me beautiful. My life has not perhaps been beautiful, but I know He's made me clean inside. And I'm no longer a slave to any of that, to nothing. I'm free.
Now with these three gifts from God, the law, the tabernacle and the sacrifices, Israel broke camp and set off for the promised land. After a long time camping, they were finally going home. Now from Mount Sinai to the promised land should have been an 11-day journey. It ended up taking just over 40 years. Now you can't blame that on the sat-nav, so what happened? Well, Israel arrived on the brink of the land and sent spies in to check it out. They came back with a mixed report. On the one hand, they brought clusters of grapes so large it took 2 men to carry them. These big grapes showed the abundance of this promised land. But they also reported big giants in the land. Now, isn't that life? God promises great things, but we also face giant-sized challenges. Now, 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, were full of faith. They said, "The Lord is with us. We can do this." But the rest spread fear through the camp. So Israel slammed their story into reverse and headed back into the wilderness, where they wandered for 40 years. Now, this moment illustrates the stark contrast between fear and faith. Fear loses sight of God and concludes, "I can't do it." The equation becomes me on my own is less than the challenges I face. So we turn back and give up. But faith puts God into the equation and concludes, If God is for us, who can be against us? The great I Am is greater than all the challenges we face put together. I wonder what giants you're facing right now. It's okay to feel some fear, but let's not give in to it and leave God out of the equation. Do the maths. If God is for us, let's step out in faith. That's the way of Exodus freedom. So eventually, 40 years later than planned, the next generation of Israelites finally crossed the Jordan and entered the Promised Land. They were led by Moses' successor, Joshua, and it just so happens that Joshua is the Hebrew equivalent of the name Jesus. Now, Jesus is our Joshua, our deliverer. He has come to set us free and to lead us home to the Promised Land.
So as we step back from the Exodus story, we glimpse the big picture. The Passover lamb, the parting of the seas, the law, the tabernacle, all those sacrifices, they point forwards to the ultimate Exodus. Now through Jesus, we can experience true liberation. Israel's slavery was more obvious and physical, but we can be just as trapped on the inside, imprisoned by fear, anxiety, guilt, shame, anger, bitterness, habits and addictions. And that's why he came, that's why he died, so that we can experience Exodus and come home to God. In John's Gospel, Jesus warns everyone who sins becomes a slave to sin. But God's Son then makes a stunning promise. If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. As the Message translation puts it, you will be free through and through. So let's use this verse to reflect on this session and the promise of true Exodus through Jesus.
There we go. The law, freedom, and Exodus. Any thoughts you want to share?
I wonder how those people all over the world are feeling that are looking for an exodus from their lives at the moment, running away from their governments, fear and being enslaved. There's so much happening at the moment around the world.
Yeah, I think it's
I think we're very privileged to be here in England, although it does still happen here. But I think for most of us, we're very privileged.
I think there are, many like videos, story we saw in the video. There are many people who are taken in by addictions and difficulties, and the more time I spend as a vicar, the more I come to realise just how incredibly messed up some people's lives are in ways I've never really understood, because my own kind of childhood was happy and idyllic, and I still sort of assumed that applied to most people naively, and I'm regularly disabused of that notion. So that is, serious and difficult, but it is different to those around the world who do suffer in ways we can't imagine, where it's the realities are actually the exodus, in the same way the Israelites being enslaved, maltreated, without any sense of hope, experiences which are far closer to them. We've seen just, this week, the chaos in South Sudan where the dean was taken and shot, wasn't he, and others in the cathedral, provinces there, and people who regularly disappear. It doesn't quite compute, really, does it? In the same way, we're much more comfortable with those stories. We can understand of the people who've suffered personal abuse and the habits and things that's caused. But the raw experience of slavery, maltreatment, and abuse on a large scale carried out by organised forces is something I don't think we can comprehend, despite the fact it's such a common experience. And yet that story of Exodus speaks into that, reality very powerfully. Even if we can't understand it, perhaps others who undergo it can make those links to that understanding. I think, again, that's the power of the story and what it means. It speaks to people in the sense of slavery in small, that's perhaps the wrong term, but in a variety of ways, be it small or big.
We can see how faith does help people, though. When we look at the Zimbabwean church and see how the people there have responded to what's happening to them, I think the faith enables them to have hope and continue their lives and be relatively happy.
Most of the people I know have had some trauma or major problems of such we've been discussing because life is like that. It has its ups and downs. But I remember going to a service at Peterborough where Desmond Tutu preached. And the last words he said was, remember, we're all only little people and we can only do our little bit in our corner. And that's what we must do, just our little bit. And I do feel that however big some of the problems are, the Lord will help us in our little corner. And I still think that's a very powerful statement. He was talking about South African problem at the time in the cathedral. I went with Michael Camp, previous vicar, and 13 other people. Wonderful ceremony, wonderful service. And I share that gem with a lot of people. If we can look after a little bit thing, in however small, it's equally valuable, very valuable, associated with our faith, of course.
There is something in that. I think in the we talk about liberation in the faith, and that is for many people, it's not going to be liberation from the tragic and horrible circumstances they find themselves in, sadly, but it's the liberation from the hold it has or the power it has over you in some way. And I think that's what we see talk about Zimbabwe as, faith does make a difference in the things people do, but it hasn't transformed Zimbabwe into a model economy overnight. But what it has done is take away the power of the government to define how people live their lives and understand their worth and value and how they work. And it's given that sense of personhood and of faith, and that sense of what life, is about amidst incredibly difficult circumstances. I think, we talk about liberation and faith, and there are lots of ways we can bring about change in people's lives. And, this diocese is doing a lot about modern slavery, which is an ongoing and hidden thing, but we only see the tip of an iceberg, and there are huge numbers of people who are still bound up in circumstances beyond their control. But what faith can do, even if it doesn't manage to free everyone, is bring that sense of freedom from a situation within a person, I think, so that we're not defined by the tragedies and the difficulties, but have something which takes us above and beyond that, even if we're still amidst the situation. I think very often people like to think Christianity is a faith about denying the nastiness of the world and hoping it will just go away. And actually every story you read in scripture, horrible things happen, and time again. And we talk about the wonders of the Exodus, but 40 years in a desert is not fun by anyone's. An entire generation is lost so that it's a new generation who go into the land. But that message of freedom is always, and of redemption is always found within that, quite literally, in those 40 years in the desert with the list, the laws and the tabernacle and the sacrifices we've heard about. And actually the idea of redemption and freedom is found not in denying the reality around them, but saying there is another way of understanding it, which takes the power of the horribleness that is around you away.
The story that Tina told was another example of the slavery, perhaps, in which she was enslaved by her younger experiences, and she found a way out.
I think it's fascinating how Matthew takes up these themes by Jesus going into the wilderness for 40 days. And then almost as soon as he comes out, or having gathered a few group of disciples around, gone around a bit, he starts talking about the law in a way, in the Beatitudes and in the things in the Sermon on the Mount, in terms of a kind of God's covenant. So taking back to the 40 years in the wilderness and the 10 Commandments.
But even before that bit, there is, Matthew does it very well, Jesus, there's the flight and the return to Egypt, the infant Jesus in Matthew's Gospel. The big word is that Matthew's Gospel is about recapitulation, where Jesus, which basically means Jesus relives most of the events that happened to Israel in the Old Testament and brings redemption to them in how he goes about them. And so Jesus is all about the law, which is quite a difficult thing, I think, for us to cope with. How do we understand the Jewish law and all those rules and regulations which we don't abide by, apart from when there's something we don't like and there's a handy verse to support our thoughts about it. But Jesus, it's Matthew 5, isn't it, where Jesus talks about, not one jot or stroke of the letter of the law will pass away.
I came to fulfill the law, not to
abolish the law. So that obviously brings the question, actually, what is the point of the law? Is it there to be kept for itself? Does it point to something else? What do you think? Because I could talk about this for a long time, only vaguely coherently though.
Well, he said something I found slightly surprising. Maybe I misunderstood it, but I always thought before that the Old Testament way was that the law was a kind of way to salvation, and that in the New Testament we learn that salvation is a free gift of God, and that that our good deeds are, if you like, fruits of faith and fruits of salvation, rather than the way by which we the way by which we find salvation, justification. But they actually said, but the law never was about salvation. It was always a gift to the people. Gave the impression that maybe the way the moral law is seen is not very different in the Old Testament to what it is in the New Testament. Or did I misunderstand that?
No, you definitely said that, because I was just going to pick up on that point, because it was interesting that he should express the law as a gift rather than something that we follow to earn God's reward. It's already there. And I suppose in a way, if the story is that they've always been God's people, then they always were God's people. They didn't have to prove anything to him. but it was God's guidance in the form of the law as to how they should live and how things should be done. And it may be that over the years that became interpreted as, well, if we follow this law, then surely that means we are living as God wants us to do, and therefore one step further, therefore we've earned God's reward, or we are deserving of God's love. But it was always there. But that's how I understood what the speaker was trying to say, which, as you say, Peter, is a different understanding of how we used to see the Old Testament.
I think that the concept of salvation is quite difficult, particularly in the early parts of the Bible, because it's not really a concept they have. You sort of live your life and then you die. And that's that. And the law is actually, the law is seen as a gift from God into ways we order ourselves into righteousness and into right living, because that's part of the covenant we have with God. And so the idea of salvation comes later, really, when things go wrong. So you start to get mentioned this place called Sheol, the kind of place of shades and grey you go to when you die. And the idea of resurrection comes out much later. You get it first in the book of Daniel and things, when actually the promises are made to David and others don't hold up. The kingdom's divided. There is no justice, and so the question comes to be, if we live righteously according to the law, where's our vindication when we're maltreated and killed for it? And so this idea comes out later of resurrection, vindication, and justification. So in some ways the law isn't about getting the points to go to heaven. It's not seen as it's understood as part of the gift of God, and you see that even in St. Paul's writings when he's talking about righteousness. Still, even though the law condemns because we can't fully uphold it, it's still seen as a gift to the people of Israel. They've had this knowledge and care of God for generations, to cherish and to share. And then Paul goes and does some interesting, clever things with those ideas, but that idea that it is still a privilege to have these. They're not just, the way perhaps we see laws as things that curtail our freedom and things we want to do, but actually they're part of our response to God's goodness in rescuing and establishing the covenant. So it's a different way of understanding law that we have forgotten about, because we always tend to read the Bible in terms of what St. Paul wrote, or actually how Luther interprets St. Paul and people after, which is quite a different thing. The relationship with the law is different, and you get that a lot in the Psalms. So you get a lot of the Psalms of people complaining that people who are unrighteous are getting away with it and having great houses and clothes and lives, and here are the righteous people who uphold God's law still are suffering for it. But they always end up with the hope that God will reverse this and they will be found righteous at the end. That's still about righteousness in this life rather than salvation as we understand it. But sorry, I'm talking too much. Please,
presumably the idea of a God giving a moral law which will bring justice to all people was a pretty radical and new one. It wasn't what gods tended to do at the time. Normally
gods are there to give you things, aren't they? Like good harvest, or to smite you, things like that, and you sort of appease them to get what you want. So it is a radically different understanding of what a God is, that actually is how they understand the nature of God. God is at his heart justice and righteousness and goodness, and the law is an extension and a reflection of that in how we're to live. So it is pretty radical and pretty different. But I think partly that's the reason why it's endured, rather than you pray to a god to so your potatoes grow. When that doesn't happen, find another god, one who works. And so you have these deities upon deities in other cultures who move around, whereas that kind of more impermeable, justice focused nature of the God of Israel in part explains why they didn't add and expand or change, because actually it's a very different focus to how other cultures approach their gods.
Answer the phone.
Just going back to what Peter was saying and this Old Testament idea, I mean, I don't think it's... You can see how these things happen, that if you like, in the Old Testament, the people felt that it was by what they did that they earned God's respect, because to be honest, I remember growing up that perhaps the view you had of Christianity was you needed to do things to be saved. The stories of the sheep and the goats and the wheat and the chaff, and you're a sinner and you're condemned and you've got to repent, in other words, do things yourself to be saved. And so you can see how that soon or can easily become some sort of idea that it's your works, what you do, that will save you, even though obviously it's God's salvation and he'll make the decision, but it is what you do that can make the difference. So you can see how that sort of, justification is not an easy thing to understand. So you can see how that sort of develop, that sort of thought process develops.
Well, I think we need sometimes, our nature as people is to know we're achieving the right things, isn't it? How we're doing that. And I see this a lot on parenting blogs on Facebook. Parents are worrying that they haven't taken their child out to 6 classes this week. How are they ever going to develop and be a fully rounded human? And you think, just talk to them and play with them. But taking them to classes is much easier because you've done something and you've achieved. And that's very much our nature as people, isn't it? We like to know we've done things. Or actually, both in the Exodus and things, God has done it, and here's how we respond. With the law and following that in the Old Testament, and us, following the life and example of Jesus in a Christian context. It all starts with, this is what God has done. Now, what are you going to do to recognise that?
So it all comes back to, what do I do tomorrow? What happens when I meet that person or pass that person? Or that's what matters, isn't it?
Yeah, and how actually, how do we share this understanding what this story is? And in one sense, as I was saying at the beginning, the Exodus is a strange one because it's not our story. We are not people who've been descendants directly of those who've been freed from slavery in Israel, but we are people who have known the action of God in our lives, and in the forgiveness and the work that's brought. And how do we share and witness to that goodness with other people is the question. Yeah, this is what God has done. What do we do about it?
But if we were to Michael was saying, if we were to believe that we had to keep all these laws perfectly in order to be saved, we wouldn't be free, would we? We would be full of guilt because none of us ever do it. No,
I certainly haven't, even under COVID, washed myself enough times in accordance with the law. I think that's that's the point that Paul comes to in the New Testament. We have all these regulations, and some of them are very, very good and important. But when we think we're going to be fine if we manage to keep this one or that one, we can't do it all, and we will fail.
Because we're human. because we're
Exactly.
human.
Yeah, and so it comes back to last week in the fall. We can't be. If the point of the law is that it's a witness and a reflecting on what God has done, then very easily it becomes actually the end in itself, and we lose that that perspective that actually all that we do is because of what God has done in the first place. And so that's Paul's concern with the law in his letters, Corinthians and Galatians and Romans especially, that the law has gone from an aspect of life reflecting the acts of God to something of death that people are trying to keep, and they forget actually the God and the story that lies behind it. And we always risk doing the same, I think. Jesus came with a message and a life which showed us the redemption of God, and he ends up with the Church of England with its arcane rules and things. Something's gone slightly strange along the way, and always being able to step back from the immediacies of the rules, the culture, and where we find ourselves, to remember always that work of God behind it is really important, but very difficult to do because we all get caught up in the minutiae, in the details. But of course, that's why we always start our services with confession, because we need to recall that actually there's something greater beyond that reality. But again, I think that's human, isn't it? We often stop focusing on the big, important meta themes and focusing on the tiny different little themes, who hasn't cleaned the pews this week or what have you, all becomes about those sort of things, and not actually very much often about the reason we're purported to be there to worship the God who's brought us freedom.
Good presentation today, I think, from the videos.
Yeah, they did very well. They're I don't know how much they spent getting it all together, but there's good videos.
Good.
Any other thoughts, or shall we draw things to a close?
Just simply to say, James, I think for me it's been really interesting and I've learnt a lot, but there's a danger just becoming weighed down by so much detail that can miss out on the focus of what it's the message, what it's really all about for us.
Yeah.
And that for all of us in some way we are enslaved by something.
Yeah.
And that by allowing God and God's love into our life, we can find freedom from that. And from that freedom, we can just love others and share that love with everyone else.
Yeah, I think, Actually, I'm not going to say anything more, Lynn. I think that's a really good summary. You don't need to...
Wonderful summing up, Lynn.
Well done, Lynn. Lovely.
Okay. Well, thank you all. There's not going to be any Bible course next week.
Why not? Why not?
Because it's my wedding anniversary, Garvin.
That's no excuse.
I've only spent 3.5 hours since I got up this morning not doing anything to do with the church. And if I do that next week, well, there might not be any more Bible course afterwards. So we'll take a break for next week.
2 weeks' time then.
And then we'll come back the week after, and we're going to look at Joshua and the judges, and how we cope with some more violence. So
it's good.
We'll hold off for...
I've enjoyed being here today.
It's been really good. Thank you, James.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
And everyone else chipping in. Interesting thoughts.
Yeah, it's really good. Have a good week, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye. James?
Yes?
Does that mean that you're not at the service next Sunday?
Yeah, no, I am at the service next Sunday.
But
you're
not taking the whole day off?
Only briefly.
No, but I thought I should, take some part of it off. That would be good. You know, I am dedicated to my work. You'll be glad to know I'm not skiving entirely, but
only half, only a bit.
We'll count how many wedding anniversaries you have.
Yeah, they're mounting up.
A year, I meant.
Right, take care,
everyone.
All right, have a good weekend, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Lynn. Bye-bye, Peter.